So picture this. It's 1983.
Right, September 1983, to
All
be
right,
exact.
September. And there's this single Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov. He's sitting in a secret bunker near Moscow, just staring at a computer screen.
And that screen is basically flashing a massive red warning.
Exactly. It's telling him that 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles have just been launched. They're inbound, heading straight for the Soviet Union.
Which is just, I mean, imagine the panic. He has mere minutes to report this up the chain.
Right. And if he does, Soviet military doctrine dictated an immediate, full-scale nuclear retaliation.
It would have literally triggered the end of human civilization.
The end of the world. But he just sits there, he looks at the data, and he chooses to do absolutely nothing.
Wow.
Yeah, he chalks it up to a computer glitch, which, thank God, it actually was.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here talking about it otherwise.
Exactly. And that brings us to what we're looking at today, because you've handed us this massive, fascinating stack of sources all about the Cold War.
A 44-year global struggle.
Right, where the greatest victories weren't actually won by firing weapons, but by choosing not to.
It's basically the ultimate paradox of the 20th century. You have these two superpowers, right? Armed to the teeth.
Literally capable of ending the world.
Yeah. And they're completely reshaping the global map, fundamentally altering the economies of dozens of nations. But they never directly engage each other on an actual battlefield.
Which is wild. So our mission for this deep dive is to kind of cut through all those endless textbook timelines, you know, the treaties and dates that put everyone to sleep in high school.
Right. We want to look at the actual mechanics, uncover the real ideological and economic levers, the covert stuff that was pulled behind the scenes.
To give you, the listener, that ultimate aha understanding of how this geopolitical standoff touched literally every corner of the globe. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, before we even get into the mechanics, we should probably talk about how we even define this conflict. Because historiography, basically the study of how history is written, is super crucial here.
Yeah, when I was looking through the sources, I was totally struck by the fact that historians are looking at the exact same set of facts and coming to completely opposite conclusions.
Right, about who actually started it. There are basically 3 schools of thought the sources outline. First, you have the Orthodox account.
Which is the one most of us probably grew up with in the West, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This perspective places the blame squarely on the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin. The argument is that Marxist-Leninist ideology is inherently expansionist.
It wants to spread.
Right. And so Stalin's aggressive moves to dominate Eastern Europe right after World War II forced the United States into a defensive posture.
So in that view, the U.S. is just playing global policeman reacting to a burglary.
Basically. But then, in the 1960s, you get the revisionist school.
And they completely flip the script.
They do. They argued the United States was the primary aggressor. They suggest the U.S. used aggressive economic imperialism, needing open markets for global capitalism, to basically box the Soviet Union into a corner.
Like before the ashes of World War II had even cooled down.
Exactly. In this view, Stalin isn't trying to conquer the world. He's just desperately trying to secure his borders against a hostile capitalist empire.
Which leads us to the third group, the post-revisionists. And this seems to be where a lot of modern analysis lands.
Yeah, it's a much more nuanced blend.
Right. They look at both sides and conclude it was this massive, tragic spiral of mutual paranoia. Both sides are making these purely defensive moves.
But the other side interprets those exact same moves as highly aggressive.
Exactly. And just to be super clear with you all right up front, we are exploring these facts impartially, exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Right. We're not here to declare a winner or pick a side.
No, we just want to dismantle the engine of the Cold War and see how it ran. So let's start dismantling. How did we go from allies who defeated Nazi Germany to bitter rivals almost overnight?
Well, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of 1945. Even the phrase Cold War pops up almost instantly.
Yeah, the sources say George Orwell actually coined it.
Right. In October 1945, in an essay called You and the Atomic Bomb, he was reacting to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Just contemplating what a society looks like, living under the permanent threat of a weapon that can erase a city in a second.
Yeah. He envisioned this polarized world in a permanent state of nonviolent hostility. The term got popularized a bit later in 1947 by Bernard Baruch and Walter Lippmann.
But the actual reality of that hostility really starts with the map of Europe. Because when I look at Eastern Europe, right after 1945, the Soviet Union is just absorbing massive amounts of territory.
Setting up those satellite states. Poland, Hungary, Romania.
Right. And from the outside, it looks exactly like classic empire building.
It does. But you have to view it through the lens of Russian history and geography.
Because they just lost, what, 27 million people in the war?
Staggering numbers. And historically, Russia has always been incredibly vulnerable to land invasions from the West because of the flat European plains.
Oh, right. Napoleon did it.
Napoleon, the Germans in World War I, Hitler in World War II.
Hmm.
So Stalin's primary objective wasn't necessarily global communist revolution right that second.
He wanted a buffer zone.
Exactly. A geographical wall of friendly meaning communist nations between Moscow and a potentially resurgent Germany.
But the problem is, the United States doesn't see a defensive buffer. They just see a totalitarian regime swallowing up sovereign nations.
Right. And they decide they have to stop it. Which brings us to the policy of containment.
Formulated by George F. Kennan, right?
Yeah.
In that famous long telegram. What was his actual argument there?
So Kennan was a U.S. diplomat in Moscow. In 1946, he sends this massive 8,000-word telegram to Washington, and he basically analyzes Soviet behavior.
8,000 words for telegram is insane.
Seriously. But he argued that Soviet leadership was just deeply insecure, inherently suspicious of the outside world, and driven by an ideology that required the ultimate destruction of capitalism.
So he's saying, don't even bother with diplomacy.
Right. He said compromise will never work. The U.S. has to apply counterforce at every single point where the Soviets try to expand.
And that becomes the absolute bedrock of U.S. foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine in 1947.
Yep. And Winston Churchill gives it that ultimate branding in 1946 with his Iron Curtain speech.
An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. But what's really fascinating in the sources is Stalin's reaction to that speech. He was furious.
Beyond furious, he actually compared Churchill to Hitler.
Which is wild, but it's a perfect example of that post-revisionist mutual paranoia we talked about.
Exactly. Churchill gives a speech warning about Soviet tyranny. Stalin reads it and literally interprets it as a declaration of war by the English-speaking world.
He thought the West was forming this hostile bloc to encircle the Soviet Union.
Right, and because physical communication basically breaks down, the battle shifts into economics.
The Marshall Plan.
Yes. The United States pours over $13 billion, which is roughly $200 billion today, into rebuilding Western Europe.
Okay, but let's pause and look at the mechanics here. Was this really just like an act of altruistic charity? Because handing out tractors and rebuilding bridges buys you a lot of political leverage.
Oh, absolutely. It was an incredibly sophisticated geopolitical weapon. U.S. policymakers knew that poverty and destroyed infrastructure were basically breeding grounds for communist uprisings.
Because countries like Italy and France had huge communist parties right after the war.
Exactly. So by flooding Western Europe with capital, the U.S. wasn't just fixing roads. They were jump-starting capitalist economies, creating loyal trading partners, and buying a firewall against communist expansion.
And Stalin sees the trap immediately. If his Eastern European buffer states take American money, their economies get tied to the West.
And he loses control. So he outright forbids them from participating and sets up the Molotov plan instead.
So now we have two totally separate economic ecosystems. It feels like a terrible roommate situation where instead of talking through their issues, they just start building a literal brick wall down the middle of the living room.
That is a perfect analogy. And all of this tension funnels into one specific spot, Germany.
Right. And specifically, Berlin.
Because Germany was the grand prize. After the war, it was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet.
But Berlin is this massive geographic anomaly. Because it's located, what, 100 miles deep inside the Soviet zone?
Yes, but the city itself is also carved into 4 zones.
I'm looking at this map, and the Western presence in Berlin seems like a total logistical nightmare and an incredible provocation to Stalin. Why hold on to half a city surrounded by the Soviet army?
Because yielding Berlin meant yielding the symbolic future of Germany. Stalin wanted a demilitarized, neutralized Germany. He wanted to extract heavy reparations to rebuild the USSR.
But the West needed a strong German economy to recover the rest of Europe.
Right. They secretly decided that a unified, neutral Germany was a bad idea because it might eventually fall into the Soviet orbit.
So the West introduces a new currency, the Deutschmark, to stabilize their zones.
Yeah.
And Stalin just snaps. June 1948, he initiates the Berlin blockade.
He cuts off all roads, all railways, all canals.
Literally holding 2 million West Berliners hostage. He's betting the West will abandon the city rather than start World War III.
But instead, we get arguably the greatest logistical feat of the 20th century, The Berlin airlift.
supplying an entire metropolis exclusively from the air.
Thousands of tons of coal, food, medicine every single day for nearly a year. Planes landing every few minutes around the clock.
It's staggering. But the psychological warfare is just as brilliant. The sources mention Operation Vittles.
Ah, the candy bombers.
Yes, this American pilot, Gail Halvorson, starts dropping tiny parachutes made of handkerchiefs loaded with candy for the German kids near the runway.
Think about the messaging there.
3 years prior, American planes were dropping high explosives on those cities. Now they're dropping candy and keeping the city alive while the Soviets are trying to starve it.
It was a massive propaganda disaster for Stalin. He was totally outmaneuvered without a single shot being fired. By May 1949, he lifts the blockade.
But the damage is done. Germany officially splits into West Germany and East Germany, and the Western powers formalize NATO.
Right. And because the threat of nuclear annihilation created a stalemate, especially after the Soviets got the atomic bomb in 1949, both sides knew they couldn't win a direct war in Europe.
If a tank rolls across the border, the world ends. So they start looking for back doors, the battlefield shifts into the shadows, we enter the wilderness of mirrors, the espionage war.
The golden age of the CIA and the KGB.
Let's talk about the Manhattan Project, because the U.S. thought they had a monopoly on nuclear weapons for maybe a decade. They assumed the Soviet science sector was too devastated to catch up.
But they were completely wrong, and it was entirely because of Soviet human intelligence.
Spies.
Exactly. Operatives like Klaus Fuchs, a physicist, had thoroughly infiltrated the Manhattan Project. They were passing highly technical schematics of the plutonium bomb straight to Moscow.
Bypassing years of dead-end research.
Right. So when the Soviets detonated their first nuke in 1949, Washington was in absolute panic. It was a monumental intelligence failure.
But the U.S. wasn't totally blind. The sources highlight the Venona Project. How exactly were the Americans reading Soviet mail?
Cryptography. The Soviets used a system called a one-time pad. If you use it correctly, it's mathematically unbreakable.
You'd use a random key once and throw it away.
Right. But during the stress of the war, Soviet code clerks made a massive mistake. They reused some of the pads.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the U.S. Army Signal Intelligence Service caught the pattern and spent years decrypting thousands of messages.
So Venona proves these massive Soviet spy networks exist in America. But here's the part that just twists my brain. Venona itself was compromised almost immediately, right?
By Kim Philby.
Yes. A British intelligence officer working with the Americans, who was actually a Soviet double agent, he told the KGB in 1946 that the Americans were reading their codes.
Which creates a bizarre paradox.
It's like playing poker, where everyone can see each other's cards, but they're all wearing mirrored sunglasses. If the Soviets know the U.S. is listening, why keep using the channel?
Because disinformation is often more valuable than silence. The KGB were masters of active measures.
Active measures.
Yeah, not just gathering secrets, but actively trying to influence events through deception. Planting forged documents, spreading fake news, sending fake defectors to the West.
Just to paralyze the CIA with paranoia.
Exactly. The CIA would spend months interrogating a defector just to figure out if they were real or a trap.
What's fascinating here, though, and the sources highlight historian Raymond Gartoff on this, despite all these billions of dollars and thousands of agents,
there were likely no successful moles at the absolute highest political decision-making levels on either side.
Wait, really? No major decisions were prematurely thwarted by spies?
Declassified archives suggest no. It was a war of paranoia just as much as actual intelligence.
That is wild. They built these labyrinthine apparatuses that mostly just fought each other. And this war of perception extended to the public, too, right, with propaganda.
The airwaves became a major battlefield. The CIA covertly funded Radio Free Europe
to project freedom and capitalist success into the Eastern Bloc.
Right, broadcasting over the Iron Curtain to counter state media. And the Soviets responded with massive radio jamming operations.
Literally blasting noise to drown it out. While their own propaganda ruthlessly attacked Western hypocrisy, like American civil rights abuses.
But while the spies battled in secret, the actual violence spilled out into the newly decolonized nations. The Cold War is a very Eurocentric term.
Right. For the Third World, this war was incredibly hot and devastating.
You had nations throwing off colonial rule, British, French, Dutch. They desperately needed infrastructure and security.
And the superpowers saw them as blank chessboards. You pick capitalism, the U.S. gets a foothold. You pick socialism, the USSR gets an ally. It sounds like two billionaires playing chess, but the pieces are entire sovereign nations with their own local histories. To the superpowers, it's a game. To the nations, it's life and death.
The non-aligned movement tried to reject this binary choice at the Bandung Conference in 1955. They wanted to be neutral.
But the superpowers basically said neutrality is not an option. Let's break down how these proxy wars actually worked. Asia, 1949. Mao Zedong wins Chinese Civil War,
The most populous nation on earth becomes communist, and Washington panics. Who lost China?
which leads to NSC 68.
A highly classified policy paper arguing containment had to be a global, militarized effort. Massive defense spending to counter what they saw as a global communist conspiracy.
And that completely dictates their response to the Korean War in 1950. North Korea invades the South, the U.S. intervenes. But the objective shift, right?
Right. Initially, it was just containment, push North Korea back across the 38th parallel. But after General MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon, the North Korean army collapsed.
And Washington gets ambitious.
They change from containment to rollback. They decide to cross the border and eliminate the communist regime entirely.
But they miscalculate. As they get closer to the Yalu River, the Chinese border, Mao feels directly threatened. So China floods the zone with hundreds of thousands of troops.
Pushing American forces all the way back south, it settles into a brutal stalemate. But it proved a terrifying concept. Total military victory was obsolete in the nuclear age.
You can't conquer a superpower-aligned nation without risking nuclear escalation. So if you can't use armies, you use the CIA, like Operation Ajax in Iran, 1953.
A textbook example of covert regime change.
Mohammad Mossadegh was the democratically elected prime minister. He nationalizes the British-owned oil company.
Because he wanted Iranian sovereignty over their resources, the British economy relied on that oil, so they asked the Americans for help. But they framed Mossadegh as vulnerable to Soviet influence.
Playing right into Cold War paranoia. So the CIA sends Kermit Roosevelt to Tehran with a suitcase full of cash,
They bribe newspaper editors, hire street gangs to stage violent protests.
creating the illusion of a failing state.
Exactly. The chaos justifies military intervention. Mossadegh is arrested, and they install the Shah of Iran.
An autocratic monarch with a brutal secret police force, the Savak. But he's pro-Western, so Washington is happy. And it's so cheap and effective, they do it again in Guatemala in 1954.
President Jacobo Arbenz was doing progressive land reforms, buying unused land for peasants, but the largest landowner was the United Fruit Company, a massive American corporation.
With deep ties to the Eisenhower administration, so Operation PB Success. They set up fake radio stations broadcasting about massive rebel armies, jammed government comms.
Created a fog of war that convinced Arbenz's own military it was hopeless. He resigns, replaced by a right-wing junta that rolls back the reforms.
And this pattern repeats globally. The Congo crisis in 1960, Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba asks the Soviets for help against a Belgian-backed secession.
The West sees that as an unacceptable pivot. Lumumba is assassinated with Western intelligence involvement, replaced by Mobutu Sese Seko, a brutal dictator.
And the scale of the violence is just staggering. Look at Indonesia, 1965 and 1966.
General Suharto led a massive purge against the Indonesian Communist Party. With Western intelligence support, they massacred an estimated 500,000 to 1 million alleged leftists.
A declassified CIA report called it one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century. But it was viewed as a strategic victory in Washington because it eliminated a communist threat.
It's profoundly tragic. Both superpowers utilized devastating tactics funding dictatorships, crushing uprisings to maintain their positions.
And the logic of containment drags the U.S. into Vietnam. And later, the Soviets get trapped in Afghanistan in 1979.
Where the CIA funnels Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen to bleed the Soviets.
Right. But while they're fighting on the ground, they're also looking up the nuclear arms race and the space race.
Let's talk about Eisenhower's massive retaliation doctrine.
It's basically a geopolitical game of chicken. How did it work?
Deterrence through disproportionate force. The U.S. couldn't afford an army large enough to match Soviet land forces in Europe, so they declared any aggressive Soviet move would be met with an overwhelming, civilization-ending nuclear strike.
The sources mentioned declassified U.S. target lists from the 50s. They planned for the systematic destruction of 1,200 urban centers across the Soviet bloc and China. Hundreds of millions of casualties.
Make the cost of war so unfathomably high that no one would start it.
But Kennedy realized the flaw there. If a minor skirmish happens, are you really going to end the world over it? It's a bluff.
So Kennedy shifts to flexible response, rebuilding conventional forces. But both sides kept expanding their nuclear arsenals to ensure they could survive a first strike.
And the delivery systems for those nukes drive the space race. In 1957, Sputnik launches, a shiny metal sphere that beeps. But Washington panics. Why?
Because a rocket is just a vehicle. The CIA watched that R-7 rocket and realized the physics. If you can put a satellite in orbit, you have an intercontinental ballistic missile.
An ICBM. Here's where it gets really interesting. The space race is taught as this glorious scientific endeavor. But the math of going to the moon is identical to sending a warhead to Moscow. Was Apollo just a glossy PR front for weapons development?
Very much so. The technology was dual use. The rockets were derivatives of ICBMs.
And they were putting military tech in space, too.
The Soviets had the Almaz program in the 1970s. Secret military space stations with high-res cameras and an autocannon to defend against interception, disguised as civilian stations.
And all this terror peaks in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The failed Bay of Pigs invasion pushes Fidel Castro to ask the Soviets for protection. Khrushchev sees a chance to level the playing field since the U.S. had Jupiter missiles in Turkey.
Right on the Soviet border. So Khrushchev secretly ships missiles to Cuba, 90 miles from Florida.
A U.S. spy plane catches them. The military wants airstrikes. Kennedy chooses a naval blockade, a quarantine to avoid an act of war.
For 13 days, the world is held hostage. Soviet ships are steaming toward the U.S. Navy. If they shoot, we get nuclear war.
Game theory saves humanity here. Mutually assured destruction meant whoever shot first died second. They were trapped by their own weapons.
So they use secret back channels? Khrushchev publicly dismantles the missiles. Secretly, Robert Kennedy agrees to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey.
The crisis is averted. Khrushchev gets ousted later for looking weak, but it forced both sides to install safeguards, like the hotline between Washington and Moscow.
And the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Because living on the brink of apocalypse is exhausting. They needed to catch their breath.
Which brings us to détente, a cooling period.
But before that, the map fractures. The Sino-Soviet split. It completely shatters the Western myth of a monolithic communist bloc.
Right. Ideology took a backseat to nationalism and ego. Mao and Khrushchev hated each other.
Mao thought Khrushchev was a superficial upstart. Khrushchev called Mao a lunatic on a throne.
And by 1969, they are fighting bloody border skirmishes, almost using nukes against each other.
Proving that just because you share Marxist ideology doesn't mean you're best friends. Nationalism trumped everything.
And Nixon and Kissinger saw the strategic gold mine, realpolitik.
Nixon goes to China in 1972.
Shocking the world. He plays the communist powers against each other, making the Soviets worry about a massive threat on their eastern border.
Forcing them to the negotiating table. Nixon meets Brezhnev. They sign Salt II to limit missiles.
The peak of détente was the Helsinki Accords in 1975, acknowledging Soviet borders in exchange for human rights pledges.
Even though they viewed human rights completely differently. But the 70s also brought massive economic shocks. The 1973 OPEC oil crisis.
Which devastated the West but actually enriched the Soviet Union because they produced so much oil.
Petrodollars. But the sources say this was a curse in disguise.
Because it masked the deep rot in the Soviet command economy. No market signals meant no innovation. Agriculture's a disaster. They were importing U.S. grain.
But the oil money let them ignore all that and keep funding the military. Until 1979, when the illusion shatters. The Second Cold War begins.
Détente dies when the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Carter responds with embargoes and boycotts.
And then the 1980s arrive. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. They don't just want to contain the Soviet Union, they want to break it.
Reagan calls them an evil empire and launches a massive military buildup. Pershing missiles, B-1 bombers, and the Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars.
Lasers in space to shoot down nukes. Scientists said it was impossible. But did the Soviets believe it?
They were terrified of it. They knew American tech innovation was a powerhouse. If the U.S. spent billions, they might succeed, rendering the Soviet arsenal obsolete.
So they have to match the spending. Which brings us to the collapse. Did Reagan spend them into bankruptcy, or was the Soviet machine just dying?
It's connected, but internal entropy was the main issue. The system spent more energy maintaining itself than improving. The corrupt elite, the nomenklatura, wouldn't cut military spending. It was 15 to 20% of GDP.
Starving the civilian economy.
Yeah.
And then the crutch gets kicked out. Mid-1980s, Saudi Arabia increases oil production.
Global oil glut. Prices plummet. The petrodollars vanish right as the Soviets are bogged down in Afghanistan and trying to match Reagan's buildup.
The math stops working. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985.
He realizes the empire is bankrupt. Introduces perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost openness and free speech.
But giving a little freedom in a totalitarian system is dangerous. People use that freedom to point out the system itself is the flaw.
Gorbachev realizes he can't afford the arms race or the satellite states. He signs the INF Treaty with Reagan in 1987, eliminating intermediate missiles.
signaling a pullback. And Eastern Europe hears it. 1989, the year of miracles. It starts with a picnic.
The pan-European picnic in Hungary. They open the border with Austria for a few hours. Thousands of East Germans rush the gates and flee.
The border guards don't shoot. The Iron Curtain literally has a hole in it. And the difference this time is Gorbachev's reaction.
He revokes the Brezhnev Doctrine. He tells the communist leaders in Eastern Europe, the Red Army will not come to save you.
Without the threat of Soviet tanks, the regimes fall like dominoes. November 1989, an East German official accidentally says on live TV that travel restrictions are lifted.
Crowds swarm the Berlin Wall. The guards refuse to fire. People take pickaxes to it.
The ultimate symbol of the Cold War, gone. And it spreads. The Warsaw Pact disintegrates. Even the Soviet republics won out.
In 1991, the hardliners in Moscow launch a coup against Gorbachev. But it fails spectacularly because Boris Yeltsin climbs on a tank and calls a strike. The military won't shoot their own people.
Power shifts to the republics. December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet Union legally dissolves. The Cold War is over.
But the hangover profoundly shapes the world today. The U.S. emerges as the unipolar hegemon.
But in Russia, the transition is brutal. Shock therapy economics in the 1990s.
Western economists advised instantly removing price controls and privatizing, but there were no legal frameworks. Hyperinflation hit.
People sold their vouchers for food. Well-connected insiders bought them up and became oligarchs.
The resulting depression in Russia was statistically worse than the Great Depression in the U.S.
And there's the paradox of decommunization. How do you purge a totalitarian system that was baked into daily life?
You can't. Your job, your apartment, it was all tied to the party. You can't fire everyone or you'll have no teachers, no judges.
It's like trying to unbake a cake to get the eggs back. So former elites just rebranded and kept power.
And globally, the end of the Cold War removed a huge pressure on Western capitalism. During the war, the West maintained strong social safety nets to prove capitalism was better.
With the rival gone, that trend reversed. Deregulation, widening inequality, and places like Yugoslavia, held together by Cold War tension, violently fractured in the Balkans.
It was an all-encompassing struggle. It dictated international capital, tech innovation, and millions of lives for nearly half a century.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. The Cold War officially ended in 1991. But think about the tools they perfected.
State-sponsored disinformation, covert proxy funding.
Massive domestic surveillance, weaponizing energy resources. Those tools didn't go to a museum, they were decentralized, modernized for the internet age.
The hardware changed, but the software of conflict remained.
So, as you look at the news today, seeing conflicts that look just as muddy and complex, ask yourself, did the Cold War actually end? Or did the tactics just go open source? Thank you for bringing these amazing sources to the table. Until next time.